is on. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. We are going to be talking today on this beautiful day in June about debt and behavior and how we might think about making a plan for that. One of the things that I hope as we go through this is a little different than maybe some of the other conversations that you might have heard around debt is really around how our behaviors tie into the situations that we're in, how that we can work toward getting ourselves out of those things, maybe interrupt some of those maybe thought patterns or behaviors that have put us in that position. I think when I think about debt for myself and the situations that I've gone through and I've really been in it, it's not as helpful when people are just like, well, just get a control of your budget. Of course, getting control of your budget is important. I think we all know that. But hopefully, what we can get out of today is a little bit of a different perspective on debt, what might be contributing to that, and then maybe small incremental things that we can do to help make it a little bit more manageable for us to bite off that big chunk of goals for ourselves. So what we're going to be covering today as we go through this is kind of talking through just the issue with debt. What we see in the United States right now in terms of debt, how our behavioral finance plays a role in the debt that we carry and what decisions we make. Some of this is so much more instinctual than we might want to believe. Then we'll talk about now what? What are some things that we can do to interrupt some of those behaviors, maybe change some of the things that we've been doing or some of our approaches, make some small manageable changes toward making that a little bit easier for us. And then we'll talk about some resources that are available to you. So that's the game plan for today. We're going to start with the debt facts. So I pulled a lot of this stuff off of some, debt comparisons and different sites, things like Forbes that talk a lot about the kind of debt that we carry in the United States today, finding out that as of 2026, the U.S. credit card debt has hit over $1.28 trillion in debt. That is a massive number. The average American we found carries an approximately 6,700 in credit card debt, and the average interest rate of credit cards right now is 22.3%. So me being me, the way I have to approach this, right, is I take it to a calculator, see, well, what would that look like? So the result was if I paid just $200 per month on that $6,700 debt, I didn't add anything else to that credit card, assuming that my interest rate on my credit card was average, it was 22.3%. It would take me 4 years and 6 months to pay off that balance, and I would have paid an additional almost $4,000 in interest on that $6,700. When we think about how we have to make a dollar stretch in the world that we live in today, every bit that we can take off of interest helps us find different uses for that dollar. So just having that as a starting point for what that credit card debt might look like and how difficult that might be for us to pay off. I think you can see why we look at these kinds of things and think, okay, if there's nothing else, getting in charge of the debt that we can makes such a huge difference for us down the road. I also looked at some of the things like our average car payment in the United States, which we're going to talk a little bit about that here because I wanted to see when we talk about average car payment, how much of a difference it makes when we start looking at some other aspects that play into our debt picture. But the average car payment in the United States is $537 for a used car, $613 a month for a leased car, and almost $770 for a new car. Auto loans, credit card debt, and student loans alone account for nearly a quarter of American consumer debt. What we're seeing, and this is kind of, again, new stuff that we're getting from data provided to us from end of quarter 2026 is showing us that some of those auto loan delinquencies in particular are on the rise. And this wasn't a surprise to me after I did a little bit of extra research on how those auto loans are being structured, particularly for those folks who might have a little bit of an issue with debt. So we're going to talk through that here. So, but when we first start talking through this, I want to make it clear that when we're talking about debt, not all debt is bad, right? All debt isn't equal. There is debt that is probably good for us to carry, or that might be considered good for us to carry. When I'm talking about debt, I'm not necessarily talking about the kinds of debt that we think of that help us generate income or build our net worth that might be considered good. So things like a home loan, I don't necessarily consider that debt bad. What we're looking for when we try to suss out whether debt is good or bad are things like, what does the interest rate look like? Is the interest rate is the interest rate pretty low? Are there tax incentives? So, for example, if I have a mortgage, the interest I pay on my mortgage is tax deductible. So there's additional options there that maybe make that a decent option for me to consider. When we think about bad debt, what we're really targeting here is debt that's considered that's a money borrowed for a depreciating asset or that has a high interest rate. Those things can really add up and make our dollar not stretch as far. So when I'm talking about debt, I am not considering all debt as bad. I am really just looking at those kinds of debt that we might consider either a depreciating asset or a pretty high interest rate. If we have those kinds of things, those are the kinds of debts we really want to be clear about and make sure we have our arms around and have a good handle on how we want to approach those debts. Debt really impacts our credit score, and credit scores are so meaningful. We're going to take a look at this in just a second. So we get our credit score range. The top three bureaus in the United States, Experian, TransUnion, Equifax. You can get onto things like Credit Karma to check your credit score if you don't know what it is. They impact us across the board for finances. When we're looking at interest rates, or when we're looking at our credit score, if you have a score that's 670 to about 740, that's considered good. 740 and above is considered very good. Anything above 800 is considered excellent. Those will have a huge impact on the things that we get in terms of the interest rates for the loans that we get on our home, on a car payment. They'll also impact things like our earning potential. Because believe it or not, there are plenty of jobs out there that when you're applying for, they're going to run a credit check on you to see what your credit score looks like. So even your ability to maybe move up or change positions in a company or go to a different company could be impacted by your credit score. Obviously, it also impacts your housing availability and what might be available to you in terms of achievable, affordable monthly rates. So all of those things are things that we really want to make sure that we're understanding when we look at our credit score. If we can do nothing else but pay our credit cards on time and try to reduce the amount of outstanding debt we have, if we can do those things, will positively impact our credit score, and we can push it up from fair to good to very good and above. We want to pay on time. That's super, super important. That's about 40% of the weight of your credit score is, are you paying things off on time? The other thing that they're going to look at are things like how much overall credit you're using, what's your credit utilization. They're going to look at, what you're really, I think, again, paying it off on time, though, is probably the biggest thing you can do. Hopefully you should be able to see this. I'm popping this up here. This is an auto loan calculator. Remember I said we were going to talk a little bit about this because this is one of those things that I thought, well, that's really interesting when we're looking at what a used car monthly payment looks like. So this is talking about if I took out a loan today for a $30,000 car, this is a used car. My term is 60 months, so 5 years. The interest rate on the average person, if my credit score is an average credit score right now, and I go to a car dealership and I want to apply for a loan to purchase this car, my average interest rate right now is 11.78%. So if I'm buying a car for 30,000, I have a $10,000 down payment. I'm putting Iowa in here. We'll also look at Illinois because their interest rate's a little higher than Iowa's. I built in my tax, registration, and other fees. You can see my monthly payment is going to be $537.84. That's what I'm expected to pay. But right now, remember I had said our interest rates are very much impacted by our credit scores. Right now, if I have a very good credit score, I am probably going to get an interest rate that looks more like this. So 6.99%. If I calculate that, you can see how much of a difference that is. It's almost $100 a month. This is one of those vicious cycles that we get in when we start thinking about debt. We're having a hard time paying things off, so our credit score doesn't look as good. So when we need to buy things like a car, we're going to end up paying more because our credit score isn't strong. It can be a little bit of a vicious cycle. So anything that we can do to break that cycle, to get on top of our debt so that we can bring our credit score up, ultimately helps us save money and be in a better financial picture going forward. I said we're going to look at Illinois too, because Iowa's sales tax is 5% for a vehicle, but Illinois is 7. So we're going to say the same thing. If my interest rate was 11.78%, I calculate that out. I'm at $551 in Illinois at that average credit score. And I am $492 if I have a better credit score. So again, this is saving a little over $50 a month. Again, impactful. It makes a difference. So I bring that up because that's a really timely thing for us to think through about how debt really does impact us going forward. It impacts our credit score, therefore the way that we go and apply for loans, the kinds of rates we get, what that results for us in terms of our monthly expenditures, all of those things. If we can get our arms around them, bringing up our credit score will ultimately help us with our debt going forward. I said this was going to be a little bit different than just talking about debt as a problem, that we were going to talk about some things that are happening to us as people that are just, it's more than math, right? There's other things that are happening when we're looking at debt and our behaviors and the ways that we might approach that. Behavioral finance is a really interesting section of financial services and planning. It's taking a look at the intersection behind how we behave, our behavioral psychology, and dollars, how we make financial decisions. It changes these, what we know is that these change over time and they really affect our decision-making process. There are things that are just hardwired into us. It almost feels like just part of human nature. We'll talk about some examples of that. The way that we process information, maybe coping mechanisms that we've developed over time when we're feeling stressed or when things feel like very difficult for us to approach or manage. Sometimes coping mechanisms that we've developed over time have behavioral impacts on us. Maybe it's things like, I'm really tired, I'm really stressed. It's easier for me just to go buy a cup of coffee than it is to make one. Little things like that, those little coping mechanisms that we've developed, finding ways to interrupt those is really meaningful for us over time in terms of changing the way that we behave toward our finances. It's not to say that any one of these things are going to make our lives overnight better, but I do think that understanding how these things might impact us may help people avoid some emotion-driven decisions. Maybe, if nothing else, give you a better informed decision about what you're going to do in the future, or maybe puts a stop or a pause about, hey, why am I going to be making this decision? Is this a decision that's really based on the knowledge and the information that I have right now, or is this maybe something else going on behind the scenes? There are a couple key things that tie in to behavioral finance, and probably one of the most important ones is around personal experience. Our beliefs are often very rooted in personal experience. It's very difficult for us to undo those things, right? The things that I have gone through, the experiences that I've had, or that my family has had, or that my community has, or maybe expectations around me, these things are shaping the way that I believe around all kinds of things, finances included. And these habits can be some of the most difficult things to break because it really comes down to understanding what it is that's driving the behavior that we have. There are a few biases that we know really impact us with respect to debt. 4 things here that we're going to talk through a little bit. One is called an anchoring bias. We have another that's called confirmation bias, recency bias, and hurting bias. Now, there are, believe it or not, there's 7 different biases that we interact with on a financial perspective. But really, these 4 touch deeply into how we approach debt. because a lot of these are things that we are not even necessarily fully conscious that we're making these decisions. They're very deep rooted in us. So, if nothing else, being aware that these things might be playing a role could be beneficial. Let's start with anchoring bias because I think this is the one that when we really start talking about these, this is the one that you'll start to recognize as soon as we talk about it. Like, hey, yeah, I have seen this everywhere. What is it? It's when initial information sets a reference point that influences all of our subsequent judgments. So a really timely example that we think of that, right? When we're just talking about interest rates on cars and we're like 11.78% is the average interest rate. That seems like a really, really high number. One of the things that we have maybe been anchored to a little is for years and years, our prime rate, that's the rate that banks lend to other banks, was pretty low. And all of our other interest rates are built on top of those prime rates. So if we have prime rates that are sitting pretty low at, 3 or 4%, that might mean that the kinds of loans or the kinds of interest rates that we're used to seeing are lower. Think about like home loans, right? A long time from the period of about 2011 until about 2018, we were looking at home loans with interest rates of like 3 to 4%. And we became anchored to that as the normal number. When actually, from a historical perspective, interest rates have been historically closer to 5 or 6%. So understanding that, sometimes we are absolutely tied to a number that has been set to us by what's happening currently or what we're seeing first. And this can lead to really skewed financial decisions over time when we set those expectations on that information that's first received. And you're going to see, you find this everywhere. So, for example, we're talking about home loans. But let's say that you have a credit card and your credit card has an interest rate of 15%. And you think, oh, that's not bad. That's pretty good. When actually, you're anchoring yourself to that 15%. So if you get a loan that's offered to you at that 11.78%, you might think that that's a pretty good interest rate because you're used to 15% and now you're getting 11.78, when actually the interest rate you probably should be paying is less than that. So it makes sense for you to really understand how those things look, to help you understand how you might want to shop around those things. If you go looking for specific numbers, you'll anchor yourselves to those specific numbers. So when you're thinking about some ways to maybe change that, be sure that you're creating, first of all, a realistic budget for your expenses, and then make sure you're comparing costs regularly and really watch out for deals because sometimes those deals are prices that have been artificially set high. So we've been anchored to a higher price so that when they reduce them, it feels like a good deal when in fact it might not be. So I think the best way to consider changing around those is just make sure you're thinking through them. You're watching out for those. You're taking a look, you're comparing costs on the things that you're dealing with or interacting with on a regular basis. Make sure that you're comparing those costs regularly. So if there's an opportunity for you to save a little bit of money, you're taking advantage of that. The second one that we see all the time is this confirmation bias. I had to laugh when I found this quote from Muhammad Ali because I think this might be something that I would say about myself. I don't always know what I'm talking about, but I know I'm right. I love that. Confirmation bias, I think, might be just about the most human of all human behavior. We are all doing this to some degree every single day. Being willing to be wrong about choices that we've made is really hard. And that's really what confirmation bias is doing. It's this tendency for us to filter out information that contradicts our beliefs and set information that just confirms them. And ultimately, what it leads to is it can lead to poorer financial outcomes because we're overlooking information that contradicts our behavior. It's hard to change those things about ourselves. These are things where it shows up the most are things where we might be overspending on things that we've deemed are necessary. So maybe it's like I'm going to pick on myself here. Just little things. It doesn't always have to be monumental changes in your life, right? But I look at like Netflix. We hardly ever use Netflix. I'm paying $19 a month for Netflix. Actually, I think it just went up to $24 a month for Netflix. Is that something that I need to be doing? Have I just decided that was necessary? Do I really need it? When we start taking a step back from the behaviors that we have and start looking at them from an outside perspective and being a little bit more objective about what it is that we're deciding to spend our money on, you can see that there might be changes that you would be willing to make or that you can make. Some ways to consider change around that is just to do that, to step back, to be a little bit more a little bit more objective about the ways that you're spending your finances. The other thing I tell you is seek out contradictory opinions. Look for some consensus information if there are things that you think are like, nope, everybody has this. Maybe everybody doesn't. So, looking out to see what additional information out there might actually help you overcome some of these biases and lead to making better financial decisions. The next one we see is recency bias. So, what is recency bias? It's when we give too much weight to recent events or information when we make a judgment. It's a really interesting kind of bias where what individuals are doing is you end up prioritizing the most recent information you have, and you assume that it's just going to be more important than information that might be a little bit older. And we have in our brains, it's just kind of a hard wiring that we have. Humans do have short-term memory dominance, which means that things that we learn more recently tend to be fronter in our mind and tend to be more important to us than things that we might have learned years ago. This can also mean like we can carry a little bit more emotional weight on things that are newer. We can put more emphasis on those things, the things that we're learning. In terms of this, what it can lead to is short-sighted decisions that distort our perceptions of trends or success when we think about finances. Two ways that this impacts us. Probably loans and distributions from investments. Number one thing that I see here. So that's going to be things like people saying, I'm just going to take a loan from my 401k because then I can pay off all my credit card debts. I'll take the loan out from my 401k. And they're not thinking about the downstream impact of that, right? I especially hear people say, I'm paying myself back. Yeah, well, you're paying yourself back and you're paying yourself back with interest, but the interest that you're paying is probably less than you would have earned in the market. So you need to make sure that you're giving weight to those things. So you can make, if you need to make that decision, you want to make sure that you're making that decision with all of the information and giving it all equal weight. So a way to consider change, just acknowledging that you might be overemphasizing recent events. Maybe look at a little bit longer term trends. Give yourself some time to reflect on relevant information. And like I was saying, make sure you're giving all information equal weight. Don't be short-sighted when we're making financial decisions, especially when we're thinking about distributions out of qualified accounts, which have tax implications for us. And it might be solving a problem for us today, only to create a bigger problem for us in a couple of months. So making sure we're thinking through that and putting all of that information on the table so we're making the best decision for us that we can. The last one that we're going to talk about in terms of biases before we kind of start talking about, well, what do we do now, is hurting bias. Now, this one, again, one of the most the human nature things that we have. This is super hardwired in us as people. It is the tendency that we have to follow the actions of a larger group, even if those actions are not good for us. This is super deeply seated within us, and this definitely shows up in things like budgeting and debt. It's the keeping up with the Joneses, right? I see this a lot too in the things that we sometimes get caught up in thinking, well, I want to make sure that, everybody else is doing this thing. I want to make sure that for me, it was with my kids, right? It was, well, everybody else's kids are in dance class. My kids need to be in dance class too. Those begin to be expensive things that add up within our budget. And they might not always be necessary things for us. So, ways that we can consider change, just be upfront about your goals and objectives with people who are close to you. You will be surprised if you are willing to do that, how many people will give you support because they're in the same boat. Sometimes being the first to talk about the challenges that you might be facing with those people who are really close to you you might be surprised how many people will rally around you to kind of help you through that. So that might be a way for you to consider, again, some small changes to behaviors that might make that a little easier to get your arms around. All right, so you have now listened to my interesting side notes on behavioral finance, and I hope you see how they really do tie into debt and the things that we can do to make an impact for ourselves going in the future. So, what do we do now, right? Let's say you're looking at your situation and you know you have debt and you're trying to figure out how do you approach this. We've talked about some behavioral things that you could be disrupting, making sure that you're taking the time to really evaluate all of your options, thinking about the downstream impact of them, taking a step back and being a little bit more objective with them, making sure that we're doing cost comparisons of the things that we spend our money on regularly. Making sure that we're addressing some of those things are all small changes that we can make toward helping us get our arms around the behaviors that lead us to debt. But then now, if we're looking at, well, how do I get myself out of the debt that I'm in? Let's start talking about some meaningful things that we can be doing. Probably the most meaningful step that you can take in trying to give yourself a leg up in debt, believe it or not, is building yourself a buffer. It is an emergency fund. The goal for an emergency fund should be 3 to 6 months of your income. You're going to invest it someplace safe, secure, interest bearing account that is liquid. That can be something like a money market. That could be something like a high yield savings account. That could be something that's kind of kept aside, maybe a little harder to get into for yourself. It's earning some money, but it's daily liquid if you need to get it. Um, why that makes such a big difference for us. You'll see here the cost of an unexpected car repair. So what ends up happening when we don't have an emergency fund is that something is going to come up and it's going to steal our money. I can't think of a time in my life. I almost can't even think of a month in my life where I haven't had something unexpected that's come up. Things like a car repair or something going wrong in my house, or my kid needs to go to the doctor's office. That one happened just last week. So all of those things, if we don't have something to cover those costs, can become things that we end up having to put on credit cards and pay interest on. So this is giving us an example. So we have a $350 car repair. If I have that in emergency savings, I'm just going to take 350 out. I can rebuild that back on my own terms. There's no time to repay that. It's not costing me anything extra. The total cost of the repair is $350. Now, the credit card, that's what we mostly see people reaching for when they hit an emergency. Now I'm going to be paying 15.99% interest. I'm going to be paying back a certain amount each month. We're going to use, in this example, it uses $25 per month. The time to repay, 16 months. I'm going to end up paying about $40 over that 16 months on the $350. Now, we all know that when I'm using my credit card, I'm probably putting more than just that emergency fund on it or that emergency repair on it. So these can really snowball. The other thing that sometimes people will do is they'll grab a payday loan. Hey, I'm about to get paid on Friday, $350, and cover that with my payday loan. If I do that, I'm going to pay $15 for every $100 borrowed for 14 days. I'm going to have to pay that back plus that fee within 14 days. So I'm going to end up paying $402.50 if I pay it back on time. So you can see in these examples, if I don't have that emergency fund, even a small little thing that pops up is going to end up costing me more money. And every dollar when we're trying to pay down debt matters. So if we can do one small thing to help us get out of debt, it's going to be building an emergency fund, making sure you're putting a little bit of money aside. If that's $5 a week, $10 a week, $20 a week, something aside every single month to help you prepare for when life throws you a curveball, because it will. And if you don't have something, you're going to end up having to go back to your credit card or go out to a loan, and it's going to cost you more money and make debt harder to get out of. When you're then looking at your debt, another step that you could take. So I'm going to build myself an emergency fund, make a small plan there. The second thing I might want to do is get a plan. The first part of that, if you could do nothing else, if nothing else happens and you're looking at debt right now, I would encourage you to look at get organized. Number one, What that means is sort your debts, list out everything that you owe, write down what the interest rate is on what you owe. So, for example, if it's credit cards, writing down, I owe $2,000 on my Visa credit card. My interest rate on that is 15.99%. Whatever the minimum payment is $40 a month. Make sure that you have those things written down so we know what we owe, minimum payment, and we know the interest rate. Making sure that we have those things laid down for all of the debt we owe. Once we have that, it's going to be easier for you. Even if that's the only thing you're able to do right now is just write those things down, it will be easier for you to come back to those and then begin to set up an action plan. And when we're looking at an action plan, the way that I would almost always tell people to do this is to sort your debt by the amounts that you owe and the interest rate so that you see what kinds of options you have. After you're looking at the minimum payment for each of those, identify the debt that you want to target. Now, there's two ways that people will tell you to do this. One of them is the snowballing method, where they'll say you're going to pay off the lowest amount of debt first and then apply to the higher debt. When we do that, it helps you pay that off a little faster. The other way people will say is, no, 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 no. Pay off your highest interest rate because it's costing you the most. If you do that, you're probably going to pay more. You're going to probably save more money in the long run by paying off your highest interest rate debts first. But if you don't know, if you've never sat down and organized that, you're not going to know which of these might make the most sense for you. If you're looking at this thinking, hey, most of these are pretty small debts and the interest rate's comparable, then I would shoot for smallest debt, pay those off first. If I'm looking at my debt and I see I have a wide disparity in the amount of interest that I owe, so maybe one is 5% and one is 22%, well, I know I'm going to want to hit that 22% first and pay down the 5%. That one can fall down to the bottom because the interest rate is low enough. So making sure that you have those kind of organized will help you identify how you want to go approach that. Then the last thing we would do, I mean, I did say at the beginning of this, right? Or this is more than just budgeting, but you do want to make sure that you're budgeting. If you've done those things, though, you've kind of looked at, hey, what kind of behaviors might I need to shake up? Um, do I have an emergency fund in place? Let's make sure I have those things going. Make a plan for myself, at least organize the debt I have. Now it'll be a little easier for you if you're ready to approach that budget. When we think about budgeting, there's a couple different ways to do this. One of them is that 50-20-30 budget rule, where it says you're going to divide your income. 50% of it goes to what you need. So the roof over your head, the food in your stomach, right? 30% on what you want, and then the goal is to get to 20% towards savings. Now, if you're in a high debt situation, you're probably not going to be able to do 20% to savings or even maybe 30% on wants. But laying it out so that you're able to see kind of what you have available for the budget will help you. Then what I'd tell you to do when you're setting up a budget, anytime you're doing these, take a look, be realistic. This ties directly to what we're talking about with respect to some of those behavioral finance things. There are things that you probably aren't going to be willing to change. So as an example for me, I am a pretty dedicated coffee drinker. Now I mostly make my own coffee, but I'm not going to tell you that it's free. And I like my fancier coffee. I try to make my own, but I really know I'm probably going to hit at least once a week. I'm going to get myself a fancier coffee. If that's true, if that's something that I'm going to do, I better plan for it. I better make sure that I'm not being Pollyanna about how I approach my finances. If I know I'm going to spend something, if I know that, hey, on Fridays we go for pizza, if that's important to me, I better make sure that that's built into my budget. Because if you build a budget that requires you to change habits you're not willing to change, you're not going to stick to it. And the goal is to find something that you'll really stick to. Make sure that you're, again, planning for emergencies. So part of that budgeting, how do we get some money set aside for emergency funds and emergency savings? And then revisit it regularly. I would tell you at first, this is something I would revisit my budget almost every week until it becomes kind of a habit, and then maybe once a month, and then maybe a couple times a year. But at first, this might be something that you're checking in with yourself really frequently on to see how are we doing here? Did I go over? Am I under? What am maybe thinking that maybe I looked at my budget and I thought, hey, this is realistic that I could cut this expense out, but it turns out it's not. Make sure that you're revisiting that and that you're planning for those things. Lastly, I'd always say when you're looking at budgets, make sure that you're paying yourself first, right? Again, emergency funds, so important to helping you get out of debt because they will help make sure that your money is not going to be robbed from you, but that you have something set aside to help with those situations when they come up. And the next one is just making sure that you're following a plan that you believe in. Um, you are more likely to stick to things when you feel like you're in control of them. And the thing is, when you're revisiting regularly your budget, so if you start by doing this, I'm going to check in every week, you'll be you'll be surprised how quickly this becomes a habit for you. You'll be surprised how quickly you'll feel in control of it, even if the debt feels really heavy at the start. So those are just some tips around how you might be able to set up a budget, maybe some things to help you through as you're trying to get your arms around the debt that you might have. Lastly, some resources that are available for you. We have all kinds of tools and articles and calculators and videos about all types of different financial education. Right now on our website at focusedfinancial.com, you'll find some articles about debt. You'll find us talking a little bit about some of the things that we've talked about today here. There's some resources for you there as well, some calculators. There's all kinds of different resources out there to help you figure out how your credit score, for example, will impact the interest rates that you might be able to qualify for. If you do have questions, always feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to help you. If you've got a situation that you just feel like, I just want to talk through it with someone, that's what we're here for. So please don't hesitate to call or send us an email. We're happy to chat with you. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording now.